So once you have concluded that there is no expropriation, right? Then was there any need to go into any other issues? Wouldn't that just rest the matter?
The claimant has alleged two different violations, one being expropriation and the other being the violation of the standard of fair and equitable treatment. These two being different, the fact that expropriation or the non-finding of expropriation, it cannot be equated to whether or not a finding under FET would come into the picture.
In the matter of compensation for expropriation, there are two categories. One is a direct legal expropriation and the other is illegal expropriation. My question is that in the case of this kind of situation, you find that there is no expropriation at all. That is not the view we have actually taken this thing. Assuming that this is actually legal expropriation, what could be the compensation? And second question, when you determine the compensation for a legal expropriation, should it be the fair market value of the particular asset or investment that has been expropriated? Or is there any principle in public international law? My second question is that, is there any principle in public international law which will actually help this arbitral tribunal in determining the quantum of compensation?
Principle of equity and bringing back the party to the state it was before unlawful and discriminatory conduct affected his or her value of investment would be applicable while determining the compensation of the same. Coming to the first question that you posed of whether or not there is, assuming that there is indeed expropriation, whether or not it would be lawful or unlawful, then this tribunal agrees with fellow arbitrator from Team C that this would indeed be a case of unlawful expropriation. Another fact which would substantiate the same is this. Even if we were to assume that the state is acting in its regulatory power, in its police power, to take measures in respect to public morals, the fact remains that the spin-off shows based on the same show, Stone Show, were not tackled or handled in any manner. Given such a discriminatory way in which the state is enforcing public morals, the tribunal would hold that due process in a non-discriminatory fashion has not been followed, and the expropriation would be deemed to be unlawful.
Clarification with respect to unlawful expropriation. I asked you a particular question whether there is a standard in public international law. So, if this tribunal has to actually create a current rule on this particular issue, what should be the informing principle in public international law? There is actually a case called the Joseph Factory case. I don't know whether you have referred to that case in the memory. In addition to Joseph Factory case, is there any other principle in public international law which will basically guide this tribunal in making a correct decision?
As held in Chaucer case, as well as applied by various tribunals therein, it is indeed the principle of equity. The fact that an investor has been deprived of his investment and the value of his investment has been depreciated, he must be compensated so that he goes back to his original position, and this compensation would help him to do so.
Principle that very basically mentioned just now, that situation. Is this particular principle now modified maybe?
Reparation for harm is indeed customary in national law.
No, it is not a principle of equity, it is actually a principle of state responsibility.
It's present in the ILC. It's present in ILC, which deals with the principles of state responsibility. And this international public document covers the same.
I have 4 comments to make in this session of this presentation. 2 of my comments are addressed to Madam Arbitrator for Team H, and 2 of my comments are addressed to Madam Arbitrator for Team D. My first comment for the Madam Arbitrator for Team H is this. My learned friend from Team H claims that there was no normative value to the policy paper of the STRA simply because it was a policy paper. However, there do indeed exist policy papers that do hold normative value. The guidelines of the European Commission on Competition Law, for instance, are widely accepted as having legal value and are often cited in a plethora of cases. Madam Arbitrator, we agree that even if the policy paper had normative value, its infringement would simply be a minor infraction which would not render the investment illegal. In this context, my suggestion to you, Madam, is this. Your analysis with the policy paper only weakens an otherwise strong judgment because there it is open to question. And therefore I suggest that you would abandon this particular problem of analysis. Madam Arbitrator, my second comment to you is this. We disagree in our interpretation of the instant facts. We both agree that there has indeed been a Commission of Evaluations report. However, we disagree on how the state reacted to that Commission of Evaluation report. However, I believe that your understanding of the report has several pitfalls. Your reasoning implies, first, that there is no substantive purpose whatsoever to the Commission of Evaluation, and second, that the claimant has approached three different legal fora, not for a genuine grievance, but simply out of sheer litigiousness. However, most significantly, Madam Arbitrator, our disagreement lies with our interpretation of paragraph 29. I would invite you to refer to paragraph 29. My first disagreement here is that the paragraph does not show that the regional court claims that it does not have jurisdiction over the matter or competence over the matter. They simply claim that they do not have competence to address the specific question of corruption. Instead, the regional court finds that public morality limits the freedom of trade that the claimant might have. Therefore, if I were to run a show such as Stone Shore in Rolling Stone, I would not have a freedom of trade, and therefore my legal rights to run a show of this nature would be entirely extinguished. As was held in several cases, including Saipan versus Bangladesh, Systems Sinai versus Kyrgyz Republic, such extinguishment of a legal right can indeed lead to expropriation, and in my opinion, the same has happened in the instant matter. I shall now proceed to address my comments to the learned Madam Arbitrator 15D. My first comment to you is this. Madam Arbitrator, you state that you rely on NAFTA jurisprudence for analysis of the fair and equitable treatment standard. However, the NAFTA differs from the treaty like the one that we have before us. Article 1105 of the NAFTA makes specific reference to the existing international law on the minimum standard of treatment of aliens. This implies that when the NAFTA is to decide a case, it will rely on the pre-existing customary international law of the same. However, in the instant matter, Article 32 makes no such reference, and the necessary implication, therefore, is that the tribunal must rely on what, in its own subjective understanding, would constitute fair and equitable conduct. Madam, you have substantial.
When you actually interpret Article 3.2 of this particular VAT, the FET would have to be interpreted autonomously, irrespective of customary international. I find that particular argument quite strange in a way because when you actually interpret either Article 3.2 of the VAT according to Article 31 and 32 of the Vienna Convention on Law Treaty, you actually achieve the same result. You achieve basically the same result. So there is no, when you actually say that you are interpreting a particular treaty provision, you are interpreting a treaty provision in the light of the principles codified in customary international, which is based on Article 31 and 32 of the BCO. So can you explain
To paragraph 14 of our report, we state that the customary international law standard of fair and equitable treatment lays the base, the minimum base of treatment that is owed to an investor. The autonomous meaning adds to this existing base, and therefore I do not suggest that my learned friend Madam Arbitrator 15D completely abrogate from looking at customary international law principles at all. I only suggest that her approach must also be informed by what she, in her subjective understanding, considers fair and equitable. I do not claim that she takes away from the customary international law standard. I only suggest that she understands that she is adding to the minimum floor laid down by the customary international law standard. My second comment to you, Madam Arbitrator, is this. Madam Arbitrator, you state in your award that pursuant to the instant expropriation, compensation is owed to the claimant. We agree, Madam, however, that the instant expropriation is unlawful. Where an unlawful expropriation is made, there is a violation of the expropriation standard in the treaty, and therefore it is not compensation but restitution that is owed to a claimant. The difference between the two is that restitution allows for a higher degree of recovery. It allows, for instance, for consequential damages, it allows for interest from the date of the instant expropriation, and so on and so forth. And therefore, Madam, I suggest that you correct your stance, and I invite you to share my opinion that it is restitution and not compensation that is owed in the instant matter. With that, panelists, I'd like to conclude my comments on the judgments of my learned friends. Would this panel have any specific questions for this arbitrator?
Yeah, I think in your first round, you were trying to perhaps comment on another team's judgment. I think that was reserved for the second round. It was not really part of the first round, but just presentation of your own findings. Now, you have also cited a lot of decisions of arbitral tribunals, right? What is the authority of that in international law?
Professor Arbitrator, on your first observation, I would only like to clarify that I wasn't trying to comment on the judgment of my learned friend, but simply trying to highlight for the benefit of this panel where the positions taken by our two tribunals differ. To your second question, Professor Arbitrator, there is no binding value of previous judgments, and they hold only persuasive value. While we are not bound to follow previous judgments, we indeed find value in their analysis of their claims, and we believe that their analysis holds value even when we look at the claim in front of us. We are not bound by them, but we are persuaded by them.
So, what will be a situation when these tribunals' decisions could have some kind of a binding law as per principles of international law? What would need to be established for being able to use these decisions in favor of an argument or in favor of a decision that a tribunal takes?
Professor, according to Article 38 of the Statute of the International Court of Justice, there are four particular sources. There is treaties, there are customs, there are general principles of law, and then there are juristic opinions and judicial opinions. There is, as Professor Brownlee comments, a hierarchy in these sources. Customs and treaties prevail over the latter two kinds of sources, and therefore there can be no instance where a judicial opinion would override what the valid interpretation of a treaty or a custom might be. It is only that a body of precedents might nevertheless create a set of opinions that later adjudicators might rely upon to shape their opinions of previous treaties or customs.
Now, on your decision on the matter of expropriation, could you explain again how, in fact, expropriation happened in light of the following? The license was issued and situation actually did make use of the license for good profits, right? It was not as if the investment was made and then no profits were made out of it. As all the tribunals have here concluded that direct expropriation did not happen, which means that whatever property that was created by the situation on the land of the was still the property of the situation, which could have been sold like a production production house or audio facilities or something could have been sold at market value to another domestic content creator or entertainment creator, and value would be taken out of it. And thirdly, what is that act of, even if we say that the license was cancelled, the facts are not clear on the cancellation of the license, because para 29, I think is referred here, it says that the situation got worse. He tried to approach court for production, but court ruled that freedom of trade is not absolute and it is subject to morality. However, unlike few courts, like example in India, where the Supreme Court has cancelled a few licenses on the basis of procedural irregularities, here the Regional Court of Kingdom of Rolling Stone did not take any such step. So where is that act of indirect expropriation which has happened in this case, and how you took certain assumptions to build that?
In response to your first question, Professor Arbitrator, we indeed note in paragraph 22 of our law that the claimant continues to have the assets that it earlier had. It continues to have the house that he constructed in Zoria. We do, however, claim that while he continued to have assets, he could not derive business from the same. Now, we do not claim that there has been a complete devaluation of the claimant's investment. We claim that there has been a substantial deprivation. The case of Pope and Talbot held that it is substantial deprivation that is the relevant standard of expropriation. And therefore, while some value might be recovered from the sale of the house and the sale of other assets, the entirety of the value might not be so recovered. And therefore, the valuation is indeed substantial.
Wouldn't you factor the profits already earned from the assets so far as part of your analysis of whether substantial deprivation happened or not? Secondly, like in various countries like India as well, and it seems in Kingdom of Rolling Stone, the license is subject to renewal, which is at discretion of the grantor. So there is no right to claim a particular license per se. Right? So if a license is not renewed, okay, would that amount to expropriation per se?
Thank you, Professor. Professor, where the I apologize, several tribunals have held that where licenses weren't renewed arbitrarily, or where such reasoning wasn't given, or where cogent reasoning wasn't given as to why licenses weren't renewed, there was indeed a breach of treaty standards. And therefore, while the state has a sovereign right not to renew licenses, there must be cogent justification for the same. That, in my opinion, Professor Arbitrator, is missing in the instant matter.
Can you point out to the cabinet decisions which claim this, and also answer if there are sufficient number of such decisions that they could be considered as principles of international law, or they are so customary now that they go into the realm of customary international law?
Professor, while I have a certain degree of difficulty finding where exactly I have cited this case, the case of TechMed would be instructive to this tribunal. Even in that case, the license of the business of continuing landfills was arbitrarily taken away from the claimant in that matter. The state refused to renew his license, and there the tribunal found a violation of both the expropriation standard and the fair and equitable treatment standard. Now, there hasn't indeed been a substantial body of judgments that would together create a custom on the matter. However, the reasoning of TechMed, that a state cannot act in an arbitrary manner, that it cannot disadvantage a claimant in such a manner, still holds valid false true. We still believe that that reasoning is extremely valuable, and it is therefore that we rely on such reasoning. Now, Professor, turning to your comments in paragraph 29 of the case file, while we do not know what the specific ratio decidendi of the regional court in that matter was, we know at least this for certain. The regional court considered whether the respondent had a freedom of trade, and thereafter said that this freedom of trade is limited by another aspect, that is public morality. Now, Professor,
Because we have actually summarized the decision and after decisions, this is actually expropriation. My understanding is that expropriation can happen when there is a substantial deprivation, but that substantial deprivation cannot be of a transient nature, it has to be an enduring or permanent deprivation. And if you look at the facts of this particular case, obviously the investor filed a case before the regional court, but there was
Professor, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
the investor filed a case before the regional court, but the investor could have filed a case before the highest court of the country as well. So there was actually an opportunity, to get the license back or the permission back. And I feel that the facts are not completely, clear in this particular case. So how can we basically say that that particular right has been taken away forever? At least when there is an opportunity for reinstatement by the highest court of the country. And so that's one point which I just want to highlight.
Professor, even if I were to defer to your opinion that there is the opportunity to later regain this license, there is a cessation in the airing of the television show of the claimant in the instant matter. This cessation of airing would substantially decrease the audience base of the show. As we point out in our report, connectedness to a particular show is a major factor in showing how an audience relates to a particular show and the number of people that subscribe to a particular show. Where this connectedness is broken, where because the show wasn't aired, audiences stopped connecting to the show, stopped connecting to the characters. Even if such a license was later recovered, there would still be a substantial deprivation because the number of people that would previously view the show are no longer viewing the show because the airing of the show has been broken. Further, Professor, I would also like to note that in Article 26 of the ICSID Convention, the rule of exhaustion of local remedies has been removed. Article 26 states that unless it is stated otherwise, there is the ICSID tribunal would be considered the sole fora in which an investor might bring his dispute, and therefore there is even no legal obstruction to the claimant from coming before us. If there are no further questions, Professor, I would like to
We have come to the conclusion that there is a breach of Article 5, and therefore there market value, and that is all. Now, we require that it is for Article 5 to begin. He has to proceed on the basis that there is public interest that is being required. Now, can you elaborate what is public interest? Public interest is a very unruly house. You can say anything about public interest. You have seen an ideology of new government, even in our country. When it comes to power, it says you do certain things, and because of the ideology, you could ban certain articles which are otherwise certainly known, even what you regularly use in your kitchen. And people are deprived of their daily food because of an ideology. Now, you are interpreting this in an investment situation. Would you therefore not consider that public interest should be looked at in a broader sense, and not in a manner which is an ideology?
Professor, there is no direct judgment on what constitutes public interest in international investment law. However, international bodies have found that public interest might be interpreted broadly. A certain degree of deference is given to a state in showing in its claims of what is its own public interest. because that is a sovereign assertion that is the right of a state to make. In our award, we find that because the respondent might validly claim that the public interest of protecting public morality is what inspires the impugned measure, we give deference to that claim. We claim that if the respondent makes a sovereign assertion that its measure was inspired by the need to protect public morality, then this tribunal will indeed accede to the same. However, we also find that the other aspects of Article 5 stand violated, and therefore, despite the fact that this measure might indeed be in public interest, it would still be an unlawful act of expropriation.
You see, public interest is like the foot of a chancellor.
Professor,
it is like the foot of a chancellor. Depends entirely on political will. You have seen in our countries that theatres and movies, there are protests by the public. There are movies should be banned. Now that's an ideology of a particular local political party. But later on the concept cut them down. So again, you cannot apply those measures in order to protect public interest. Riots and violations take place. It's not good enough. Public interest, public policy has to be guarded in a manner that a country which wants investors to come in at a very different, higher level. Because you are only giving fair market value and restituting. That's not good enough. And investment comes in order to get something more than that. And I do not therefore make indirect compensation.
Professor, I'd first like to point out that since in our report we later think that there is indeed unlawful expropriation, we are indeed allowing the claimant to claim the value of its investment. Further, while we might disagree on what constitutes the public morality or what should ideally constitute the public morality of the state, we cannot challenge the sovereign assertion of the state that something constitutes its public morality. Public morality, as several WTO panels have found, is a highly dynamic concept. It changes according to a variety of factors. It changes across time, it changes across regions, and therefore an external tribunal situated in another country cannot tell a state what its public morality ought to be. Since we are distanced from the immediate context of the state, we do not have a right to challenge the sovereign assertion of the state as to what its public morality is.
But you did cage it at the time to give the license. You did cage it at the time to give the license.
Professor,
This is not going to change your view.
Professor, I still did not catch your question very
You did have a particular standard and measure to give the license. And you should change your view after investment was made in the domestic place.
Professor, I'm so sorry, but I still do not Professor, there were different governments that dealt with the introduction of the investment and at the instant matter where the license was taken away. However, that is the prerogative of a democratic nation. Different governments, when they are in power, might believe their beliefs on how to run the country are supreme. One government might believe that a certain direction is advisable. Another government might believe that another direction is advisable. But it is indeed a sovereign nation, it is indeed a sovereign assertion that the state is making in either case. And while there is indeed a requirement that they maintain a certain degree of consistency in their policies, this does not amount to the fact that we can question what a state believes at the end of the day is the best for its own country.
That's what the investment is. Economic reasons and argument. For an ideology of a new government, can you call it public interest? It is your ideology, and therefore you take it away. Would that come in confiscation? Or would that be just fair compensation? That is, if you have an ideology which is different from that of the predecessor, would you therefore deprive an investor who has bona fide income that my investment will be allowed regardless of what will be the government in power? Because it is an apolitical situation in a global scenario. And you are thereby a different ideology. Fair enough, you stop it. But surely it should not just be giving back his investment. He should get something more than that for which he was promised. That you will have a right to exploit it, and therefore you should get what your team has come to the conclusion. Isn't that a fairer conclusion to come with? Because your ideology has changed.
Professor, I indeed do agree with you. And in the award that I have delivered, in our analysis of the fair and equitable treatment standard, we do indeed claim that the sudden assertion of public morality violates the standard. But we give a more balanced opinion over here. We claim that while there will be a change in policies that will generally apply to the respondent state, that this change in policy ought to have come in a fairer manner. There ought to have been negotiations with investors, there ought to have been consultations with investors. The investors will not have been coerced or harassed into accepting such a policy change. And therefore we believe that while a nation has a sovereign right to change its policies, the same must be done in a manner that comports with the fair and equitable treatment standard. And that balanced view is the position that we take on the matter.
What about the public morality? I'm not very familiar with the jurisprudence in international investment law, but in particular disputes, a number of cases have actually come up. The China obligation case, seal case, gambling. In all these cases, the WTO tariffs were actually introduced to a very high investment necessity. The measure has to be extremely proportionate to the need of the objective that is already achieved. There should be least restrictive or restrictive measure. So, does this particular measure actually meet all this proportionality or necessity?
Professor, there is indeed the view taken by the case of US gambling, ECC products, and China individual products, that the necessity threshold must be fulfilled. But that comes for a reason, and that reason is that Article 20A of the GATT states that a measure must be necessary for the protection of public morals. It is not the interpretation of the term public morals, but the interpretation of the term necessity from which this opinion is taken. And because this specific necessity requirement is not there in Article 5 of the Bilateral Investment Treaty, we cannot treat the same as necessary.
The reason the burden of proof should not be shifted is because it leads to setting aside of the arbitral award. When the burden of proof is shifted, it eventually leads to heavy cost on the award, and that leads to setting aside of the arbitral award. As per Article 53, Clause 1 of the ICSID Convention. When we move further, paragraph 44 fails to mention as to what flags have been implied for corruption, which in this case the present arbitrator has successfully mentioned about the flags, which is flag 6, 12 and 18. Coming to answering the question, what they have addressed is that there is no that the FCPA guidelines is restricted to domestic purpose. This is a wrong intuition that they have mentioned, because agreed FCPA had evolved from a case known as Watergate scam, but this has gotten international standards in the year 2010. That's the reason it is being stated as the FCPA guidelines 2010. Coming to para 50 of the judgment deliberation of my co-arbitrator of Team H, it refers to mention as to what leads not of the dialogue, as to why is it not an expropriation. Sorry.
On the burden of proof, you actually mentioned alleged corruption, honest problem. If you look at the international law for that matter, there is a general principle that the party who asserts has the burden to establish that thing. But this is actually an inflexible standard, because in some of the recent cases, at least in the WTO case, the US Fortune case, where India was actually involved, the WTO appellate court has said that you have to actually look into the facts of the particular situation. So in certain situations, a party may have only primary government to show that this particular situation exists. So if you look at the facts of this particular matter, the raising of the facts by itself, in my opinion, has actually raised a primacy proof that corruption has actually existed. Then in that particular situation, should the burden shift to the other side, basically to show that the claim is not equal.
Much obliged, my honorable tribunal. When we are talking about shifting of burden of proof, before we talk about this, I would like to say that the main intention of the ICSID tribunal today is to set standards, and the judgment that has to be drawn out here should be very clear so that it can be used as a precedent. When this arbitrator talks about the onus probandi rule that has to be applied, it has been held in many cases, and in the facts which we have, it will, if I state that the burden of proof should be shifted, there will be two consequences. The risk of setting aside of the arbitral award will be invoked, and when you are talking about onus probandi rule, it is also written and stated in the general principles, international general principles.
Here, my question was slightly different. When a particular party actually raises a claim, the party doesn't have to enter into the claim at that particular stage. If there is a primary case, then the burden will actually shift to the other side. And during the entire process, the burden will actually go back and forth. So my doubt in this particular case is that the meeting of the facts, what we call the red facts, right? Does it actually constitute a primary claim proof on the party with the respondent's claim in this case?
We introduced the FCPA, under the FCPA guidelines, the rise of the flag 6, 12 and 18. It was with the help of the drawing of adverse inference, the principle of drawing of adverse inference. Coming back to the part, the reason why I am using onus probandi rule is because in general, if you shift the burden of proof on the person who is not claiming it, it's very difficult to prove that, because they don't have substantial evidence to prove that they are not corrupt or they did not do anything wrong, because the existence of evidence won't be there. Whereas the person who actually put the allegation has put the allegation with respect to certain substantial evidence. Out here, in the facts of the case, we can clearly see the respondent says there has been scope of corruption. So when the state is stating that there is a scope of corruption, that means there must be certain evidence that they have to show that there is a scope of corruption. That's the reason we have complied with the onus probandi rule. Moving on to my brother arbitrator, he had asked a question, he had stated, he tried to correct this arbitrator about the remedies. Well, there has been a small mistake on their part too, that when there is an unlawful expropriation, we give reparation, not restitution. In the case of Scholzer case, it talks about nullification of expropriation, which states the nullifying effect of the expropriation that has been done, which means they will be entitled with such a damage that will nullify the effect of the expropriation. Arbitrator states this thing in order to answer the question that it has asked to the sister arbitrator, Team H. And this arbitrator would also like to appreciate the fact the way the brother arbitrator has come to the concept of the estoppel in the issue 1. Apart from that, it would be a mere advice to my brother arbitrator that they should have stated all the 7 principles of the FED, because we are setting standards
your distinction between reparation and restitution. If you actually refer to page number 14 of your portfolio and basically article 30, 34 of the articles of state responsibility to make the international obligation.
Just a moment.
Right.
Can you just, it's a request from the arbitrator if you could repeat.
Yeah, if you actually look at the page number 14, page number 14, and if you look at the middle of that page, there is a reference to Article 34 of the International Corporations Articles of State Responsibility, where it very clearly says that good reparation actually includes shall be in the form of the restitution, compensation and satisfaction, either simply or compensation. So it doesn't actually eliminate the possibility of restitution. The word reparation actually includes the restitution as well.
Yes, but the term that is used when there has been an unlawful expropriation is reparation. That's what I was trying to state with my statement which I just made. That's it. Any further questions that you would like to?
Now, in that FCPA, the use of those principles, how would you justify that as a part of international law? So I think the arbitrator pointed out four principles and four bodies of international law. So how would you justify that the FCPA is actually part of international law and not domestic law as the edge just pointed out?
The arbitrator would like to get back to it with further research. But so far as the research that we had, the arbitrator had conducted, there is a legal document with respect to the FCPA guidelines. I have the soft copy of it. If you want, I can.
Legal documentation on FCPA guidelines by which body or who issued, like how is FCPA part of international law? Because Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is a US domestic law, like UK has UK Bribery Act, India has Prevention of Corruption Act. So how did one domestic act, according to you, was made a part, like a part of international law?
What the arbitrator feels is that the sole purpose of an arbitrator is to set standards. So, in order to provide justice to the parties who come to the court, they need to refer to as many principles as possible to actually meet to the to actually give a sensible elaboration of the judgment. So maybe that's the reason the FCPA guidelines have been given an international status, because corruption in today's world is everywhere. You cannot actually tell that corruption in India is different from corruption in US.
Well, I would clarify that FCPA is statute for corruption in the US. In UK that India is a different act of our own country. Corporate governance is the foundation and a rock bottom block for all commercial transactions worldwide. And therefore, that becomes international public policy. There should be no corruption. And there should be no corruption in the judicial jurisprudence for commercial transactions. With each statute for each country may be a country statute. Somewhere next to the jurisdiction like FCPA, which goes to all US citizens, UK corporates outside US, etc., India has no public service. So you have different shades of statute. The foundation, the rock of the requirement in all commercial transactions is there should be no liability in order to make this. And I think that is why it's an international framework.
Yes, much I do not explain this in
Therefore, that's a comment. That it doesn't have to be just in hand. You look at what the basically act is, which is a thing which falls under corporate governance, which is globally recognized in international transactions.
Thank you, Sir Arbitrator. Actually, I'm not very well versed.
That's fine.
Are there any further inquiries that the Honorable Tribunal would like to make?
Goodbye, just a comment.
Thank you so much. I shall terminate my review of the judgment for my
This tribunal would like to conclude the judgment that it has rendered. However, it would first address the matter of expropriation, given the amount of controversy it has created in this field. In light of all the facts provided, and without making any presumption, the tribunal cannot find a case, a claim for expropriation, direct or indirect.
For all three finalists and our judges for the judgment television competition final rounds. I would request a member of SPIL Mumbai to kindly present a token of appreciation to first Mr. Julie Senapara. And Mr. Akshay.